Welcome, viewers, to this new episode of Beyond Phrenology. In this podcast, we venture into the cutting edge and often the fringe of cognitive sciences, neurosciences, and the philosophy of mind. Today, I'm extremely thrilled to welcome Professor Michael Anderson. He's one of the most provocative thinkers in contemporary cognitive neuroscience. Professor Anderson is a professor of psychology and neuroscience. He's pretty celebrated for his groundbreaking work on embodied cognition, neural reuse, and the dynamic interplay between the brain and environment. Uh, he's known for his strong challenge of the long-standing computational and representational paradigms in neuroscience. He has been urging us to rethink the brain as more than a biological computer, something more than that. He has a very acclaimed book called After Phrenology, Neural Reuse and Interactive Brain, where he has argued against the reductionist mapping of brain regions to cognitive functions. And beyond his academic contributions, he's pretty compelling advocate for interdisciplinary dialogue in general. You will see him often on podcast and different shows, uh, often weaving together insights from psychology, philosophy, artificial intelligence, and evolutionary biology, and proposing bold theories which can actually change the course of how we think about the brain and the body in general. So today we'll discuss some of the contentious debating issues shaping modern neuroscience. We'll talk about his background in general, the limit of representational thinking, the pitfalls of computation metaphors of how we think about the brain in general currently. We will also touch upon the free energy principle and talk whether we can have some principles or laws to understand how the human brain works. So, welcome all of you for a stimulating conversation. We hope to unsettle some conventional wisdom and spark some new perspectives on the show today. So, Professor Anderson, welcome to Beyond Phrenology.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
So, Professor, I would like you to give a little background of what all did you do that I waited for almost 6 months to have you on the show and discuss these topics with you. I mean, you have been doing a lot of work, but a little background on what inspired you to begin with your career in neuroscience and cognitive sciences, and also taking the a very controversial, or not so much controversial, I would say, but a different and probably more productive take which you have.
Well, we'll see whether it turns out to be more productive. It's certainly been interesting. Um, yeah, I kind of took the long way around the barn, frankly. So, as an undergraduate, I studied medicine and philosophy, and thought I would go into kind of philosophy of science. So, very traditional subfield of philosophy. And while I was working on that, I got interested in language and this issue of intentionality, right? How is it that the mind can connect up with pieces of the world? Um, and I just started being dissatisfied with some of the answers, some of the debates, and that led me into, as you mentioned in your introduction, this issue of embodied cognition, something that hasn't been treated or hadn't been treated very much in the analytic philosophy tradition, was a bit more treated, but in a way that I found quite unfamiliar in the phenomenological tradition, although I've tried to learn quite a bit about that. Um, but that sort of led me down this path of understanding the way in which situatedness and embodiment really play crucial roles in our understanding of how it is the mind is ensconced in a physical world. And it leads you eventually, I mean, this is maybe the issues for an entirely different podcast, but away from issues of dualism and much more towards I mean, and activism is one strain that picked up on some of the same things. Evan Thompson, who's probably the central proponent of an activism, he was actually just started a position as a professor down the street from where I was a graduate student. So we actually met for coffee occasionally. So that goes back to the late 80s, early 90s. So I've been interested in those kind of things for a long time. And then, frankly, I I landed after a series of different sorts of jobs. Maybe this is useful for some of the listeners, especially those who are, just trying to enter the field, it can be hard to find a position, as they'll be well aware. I had an initial position at a small teaching college, St. John's in Annapolis, which is a wonderful place to be, but wasn't quite the right fit. I went from there through industry and worked in biotech for a number of years on the kind of research and computational side of biotech, and went from there to do a postdoc in artificial intelligence. And then that's where I sort of stumbled on this issue of neural reuse that you mentioned. That's the subject of the book. And a lot of my recent, well, a lot of the work over the past decade or so has been on that subject. Um, and that came about because I sort of in my spare time, I was using some AI data mining tools to look into collections of brain imaging studies and try to answer some questions that I had left over, empirical questions I had left over from my theoretical work in embodied cognition. And the data didn't look the way you'd expect, just thinking about it from an embodiment standpoint. The story looked like it had to be broader than that. And that's what led to the hypothesis of neural reuse. And that work led to a position as a psychology professor. And I had that job for about 12 years at Franklin and Marshall in Pennsylvania, and then moved up here to Canada at University of Western Ontario in Canada, and have continued that work here. So yeah, I bounced around quite a bit, but picked up a lot of knowledge in lots of areas in philosophy and in computer science, programming and artificial intelligence, and psychology and neuroscience. And so it's just been kind of a living my way through this moment. It's and just sort of discovering along the way all of the great work that's being done in so many different areas, but which need to be brought together into
Yeah.
if not a unified picture, at least a picture between the parts of which there's some interaction and dialogue. So Beyond Phrenology, your podcast, obviously related to after phrenology in the title, and after and beyond, of course, are related. The after phrenology actually, and this is it's not an inside joke exactly, but I know it's an obscure reference. So one of my teachers as an undergraduate was Alistair McIntyre, and his magnum opus was After Virtue. And the main thesis of that book was that the study of ethics had been split up into three competing camps, all of which had really perfectly reasonable things to say about ethics, but none of which could offer a complete theory. And if you brought them all together in the right sort of way, you could offer a complete theory of ethics. And so the after and after phrenology is beyond, but it's
Yeah.
also a reference to that there are these sort of splintered pictures of the functioning of the brain. And if we bring them together in the right way,
Yeah.
we can start to learn, a lot more.
Yeah.
That's was the project anyway. And again, I came to it
Yeah.
through a lot of life experience in lots of different areas of both academia and industry.
So for the viewers, just to touch on some of the things you mentioned, in terms of how hard landing a position is, there are less positions tenure track in neuroscience and cognition than there are medals in Olympics. So it's that difficult for people who are planning to be academics. And for Professor Anderson's group, so for viewers, he has a large group of very talented students and trainees. I have several of those write contributions for my recent and upcoming books, and I'll tell you like those are some of the best essays we have. So he incubates some of the best minds and minds with alternate ways to think about the cognition and neuroscience in general. So, Professor Anderson, it was a pretty packed, monologue. You had a lot of keywords there, very important, and important in the sense that what we make of those have huge implications on how we go along tackling, those topics. So, for instance, embodied cognition. People have different views of embodied cognition. Right now, I'm working on a book on embodied cognition. Almost everyone I ask about embodied cognition has a very different way they want to bring in body or the role of the body in cognition. That tends to be a primary theme. So what's your take on what exactly is embodied cognition and how, like, was cognition not embodied until now that suddenly we are talking about embodied cognition when Skinner was doing experiments with, pigeons, for instance, right? I mean, pigeons were using their feet with that claws, and rats were using, something else, for instance. Pigeons were using
Sure.
beaks, sorry. Rats were using their claws. So cognition was embodied even then, in the experimental paradigms. So how is it different now?
No, this is an excellent and difficult question. So if you think of embodiment in a really sort of thin, minimalist sort of way, yeah, there's almost nobody, unless you're really interested in sort of mere spiritual essence and the functions of spirit in the absence of embodiment, which I suppose some religious traditions are interested in this. Um, but you can say that cognition has been embodied since anyone ever thought about thinking. But to get that thesis off the ground, you have to point to things like, well, yeah, of course, Plato was super interested in how the mind related to physical stuff. And, Socrates famously talked about, well, maybe the soul, that is the thinking part of the person, is like it's like the tuning of an instrument. It's the tension in the strings. So it's sort of a thing and it's sort of not a thing. And it's the kind of thing that maybe goes away when the instrument is destroyed. But it's not a part of the instrument you can take apart and take out of it. So there has been a struggle for thousands of years with questions about the relationship between mind and body, and this ongoing sense that we have that these are very different things. And that there are, Chalmers being the most famous contemporary example, that there are aspects of experience, um, or in his case, experience itself, strictly understood in terms of qualitative features of experience, that these things go beyond the reach of the physical sciences in some sense, and point to aspects of the universe that aren't physical. Um, I've never been a fan of that starting point. Um, this is not to deny the pull of that view and the mystery of experience, the mystery of subjectivity. But I think that's a problem to be contemplated and not a starting place to be comfortable and try to get comfortable with a form of dualism. Anyway, back to your question. It's right to say that in that sense, people have been thinking about the embodied mind since they've been thinking about these topics. Um, but that, how to put this, that's not the sort of sense of embodiment that is most of interest to broadly speaking embodied cognition. And I guess one thing I should say is that, there was no such thing as embodied cognition when I sort of started thinking about these things. And activism had just, so Varela, Thompson, and Roche had just published their first big book on this area and in activism. And so, Andy Clark had written and published Being There, that explores some of these issues, right? So the ideas were starting to be formed in the sort of early 90s and, that period. And it was clear from the beginning they were after something more than just a solution to the mind-body problem. What people were noticing is that the processes of thinking, the content of thinking, um, the variability to think, again, I got into it, as I mentioned, through the issue of intentionality, right? The capacity to think about stuff in the world. All this required a kind of story that went beyond merely saying, oh, well, it turns out that mental states supervene on physical states.
Hmm.
And so, right, we have some kind of solution to how a mental entity and a physical entity can exist in the same universe without a kind of dualism. No, this is much more about re-understanding what it is to be a thinking thing, right? And a lot of it, of course, in the contemporary issue is explicitly anti-Cartesian,
Hmm.
right?
Right,
Because
right.
Descartes, for various reasons, wanted to make sure that there was a special realm for the mental that was carved out
Yeah.
from the realm for the physical. And, he was a mechanist through and through when it came to the physical world, but he just couldn't
Yeah.
fathom that the kind of mechanistic explanations that he was giving for particles moving around that explained why things moved. He was very impressed with the, as it were, AI of his day, the automata,
Yeah.
robotics, and stuff. And that is fascinating, that mechanistic worldview, and of course has been wildly successful. But he thought, language, thought, the 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 essence of what we consider our humanity, these things aren't really touched by those kinds of explanations. The contemporary thought has been trying to push back on that set of assumptions, and to begin not with thinking, which is really kind of where the history brought us, right? We started with a contemplation of contemplation, with a contemplation of human thought and what was
Mhm.
special about it. And when you start there, it can be hard to come around to the view that it has its place in a physical universe, as it were, from the beginning. If you start from the other end, at least this was sort of the strategy that many people in embodied cognition and in activism took. If you start from the other end, you think about, well, how is it that organisms maintain themselves in an environment? And by maintaining themselves, you can talk about cellular processes, right? Autopoiesis and self-maintenance in that of very little sense, but also you have to gather nutrition. You've got to move around. You have to avoid predators and seek out prey, or forage for vegetables. Whatever your mode is for surviving, you've got to figure your way about the world in order to do it and maintain yourself.
Yeah.
And suddenly that creates a very different picture from if you start with chess playing things, right?
It's a, it's a,
One of my favorite lines from Andy Clark is that no. What you understand is that humans are a lot like dogs,
hmm.
good at frisbee and bad at math,
Yeah.
right? And so why start with math? Let's
Right.
start with frisbee and figure
Right.
that out.
It's a lot to ask for a clump of cells, to do so much.
And yet they do.
Yeah, they do. Yes.
And that's in some ways the jumping off point of the autopoietic
Hmm.
tradition, and it is incredibly interesting, and it's got its own mystery, right? So
Yeah.
one of the things I object to, is the notion that somehow, if you're a physicalist in this sense,
Yeah.
that the mystery leaches out of the universe in some sense. That's couldn't be further from the truth.
Right.
Simple cellular processes are fascinating,
Right.
and uh, and the wrong way to do is say, well, that must mean there's some spiritual substance there, right? As if all mystery is the purview of the spiritual.
Yeah.
No, there's physical mysteries of nature
Mrs.
that
Yeah.
we can grapple with, and we can grapple with those in very productive ways. But
Right.
when we're really engaged in grappling with those in a serious way,
Right.
they open up vistas for understanding higher order things
Right.
like the human mind that are closed down when you start from that, thinking you
Yes.
understand it.
Right.
Yeah,
It's interesting. Like these aspects are so much, or your approaches are so much determined also by your how you are raised, or your religious background and things like that. So if you look at the East versus West, in Eastern religions, you have the strong idea of soul and the idea of reincarnation, and the soul, the same soul actually going through organisms over organisms across lifespans. And you are reincarnate as a human in once in like a number of births, which kind of is very computational in the sense of the software is different than the hardware kind of idea, but at
mhm,
the same time it's very evolutionary friendly that there's a continuum of cognition across all the animal kingdom. On the other side, a lot of monotheistic religions, especially West, very friendly in terms of having the materialist, substance, and that's the end of the software. But at the same time, not very evolutionary friendly in terms of the continuum of across organisms. So even different religions have touched on different aspects, or they have been shaped by different ways of thinking about the soul and the body. You know.
sure. No, absolutely. And I haven't said the word evolution yet, but that's obviously one of the main pillars that
Yeah.
informs my own work, and is one of the things that has to be brought into the fold if we're going to understand the human organism.
Right.
And you're right to imply that certainly early neuroscience was mechanistic, but not evolutionary.
Hmm.
There was reverse engineering, more or
Right.
less.
Yeah.
Let's try to figure out the way the thing must work. Okay, we'll poke and prod at it and figure out what the mechanism must be. And we can do that in the absence of any thought about the form of life
I think it still
within which that
is.
mechanism sits.
I would argue it still is. I mean,
Yeah.
yeah, we are working on different organisms, but I don't think we still have a bridge or a way to, kind of make sense of all the data in the same light, in the same evolution light. To some extent.
No, no, you're right. We're nowhere near the end game for the science of the human being, right?
Yeah.
Um, uh, but it's true that I think evolutionary principles have only started to be taken seriously, and of course that's a loaded word, seriously, but only started to be taken seriously quite recently. I mean, the theory of evolution, at least as Darwin stated it, is quite young in the grand scheme of things. And of course, the initial response to it from some quarters was mere resistance,
Yeah.
and remains so in some now much more limited
Yeah.
quarters. But um, and it does, it's one of those things. Um, Dennett called evolution a universal acid in the
Hmm.
sense that it eats through preconceptions. And he's right, but that's a really destructive metaphor.
Yeah.
I'd like to think it's something more like a universal cement.
Or solvent, yeah.
Well, a solvent, but only if you're going to then
Yes,
take the
right.
solution and do something with it.
Right,
Yeah.
right, right, right. A cement is a
Um,
better idea, yeah.
yeah. So something that can be used to stick pieces together
Hmm.
that didn't seem like they might fit previously. So and we don't know everywhere how to do that, right? What's the right way to take on board the fact that, and I'm not against mechanism, by the way. You were right to point out in the introduction that I've been critical of the representational or computational theories, and we can talk about that if we get around to that. But not mechanistic ones. Mechanism is the most successful scientific strategy
Yes.
that we've devised. It's just that it gets misapplied in various ways, and there are ways of applying it which don't take natural selection into account, don't take the constraints of the developmental
Yeah.
constraints into account as parts of understanding what the mechanisms might be like. And it's hard to do that, of course, because we can't manipulate the evolutionary process. So it's got to be an observational and not an experimental science. And that means it's got fewer restrictions on the hypothesis space,
Hmm.
and fewer ways to limit the space.
Yeah.
It's still, we do it and we can do it, and we're getting better at doing it. But yeah, there's a long way to go.
So how do you feel about the current state? So there are two ways to look at it. One way is that we are producing so much now. We have so many talented people, in the enterprise. Okay, we have so much more money being pumped in to understand the brain or cognition in general. So the good part is that we have the infrastructure both and human resources, to tackle some of these large questions. The other perspective to look at is that the more big the enterprise is, the more likely it is to drift in a direction because of you know its own constraints like funding and how academic training works, how institutions interact and things like that. So it can be good as well as bad for us going towards the that end goal we want to go towards. So we are definitely going fast, but we don't know whether we are going towards that end goal or we are going in some other direction where we have to have, a directional shift or a completely, a rethinking of what we are doing. So where do you think we are in those sense? Or we have multiple kind of tentacles. So perhaps one of those tentacles will reach towards the end goal.
Yeah, I don't know where we are. If I did know, I could steer us in the right direction. At least I don't know where we are relative to important,
Hmm.
milestones that we want to hit. What you say is true, that merely spending more on a problem isn't going to be a curative. It doesn't hurt very much,
Yeah.
right? And I'll say that as someone and not alone, of course, but amongst all of my colleagues, right? We're all constantly looking for funding for our students and for our work and to push things forward, and we're all doing the best job we can in a resource constrained situation. So it's always to be celebrated when people are interested in
Of
investing
course.
more. But yeah, then there's the question of what you invest in, and a lot of uh, money goes into technology development and ways of and it's been the past 50 years and especially the past 20 have been astonishing with respect to technology development
Yeah.
for ways of studying the brain, right? If you think about it, not too long ago, there was no EEG, there was no
Yeah.
MRI. There certainly wasn't the kinds of genetic manipulations, the optogenetics and things like this that we can do. There was no FNIRs. I mean, there are so many technologies um, that are coming online or have come online, some of which, like MRI, of course, have been, really broadly adopted and applied. Um, But those things gather data.
Yeah.
Data is the lifeblood of science. So that's great, but data doesn't interpret itself. It's both collected under and is understood in light of the theories that we bring to bear on designing the experiments and deciding what to look at, what's important. And then once we have those data, interpreting it in light of the kind of structures that structures of thought, as it were, that we bring to bear on the problems that we have. There's relatively less, much less spent on theory development than there is on technology development.
Oh, disproportionately, like orders of magnitude less.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
and I guess that is in part because people have the notion that the theories sort of take care of themselves as the data is accumulated.
Hmm.
And I think historically speaking, that's not really true. Um, so it would be nice to see more money spent for theory development in particular, or for projects, even if every project, ideally has an empirical component to it, but projects that were more theory heavy than data heavy. But most funding agencies really like data-oriented projects.
Hmm.
And look, my own empirical work has relied on all those, right?
Yeah.
I do some, but not very much experimental work myself, right? The findings that I have published have all come from, again, not all, but 90 some odd percent of them have come from analyzing data gathered by other people,
Hmm.
data that was made available
Yeah.
either in publication or through repositories of various kinds, which, by the way, shows you how important those things are.
Hmm.
Um, so I would never in a million years say that collecting data isn't an absolutely crucial aspect of the enterprise. Um, but we need to be thinking at the same time of exploring the theory space
Hmm.
in a more thoroughgoing way than we don't tend to prioritize that.
But
Um,
but but why did that happen in case of biology and neuroscience? Because when you think about physics, for instance, there was a time when theoretical physicists were probably the most powerful lobby as academics,
yeah.
right? Especially uh, our Manhattan Project and things like that. And even after that, when the Institute for Advanced Studies was set up at Princeton and probably at other places, similar institutes were set up. So why is it that theory development has lagged in neuroscience and cognition, especially in terms of its support compared to other fields in which it has been supported historically and even celebrated?
Yeah, well, You should definitely get an historian of science on here to talk about this because it's fascinating.
Yeah.
Why did physics develop the way it did, and other sciences have followed different trajectories? It's all going to come down to the particular pressures that are brought to bear on any enterprise. So, as someone who's not an historian,
Yeah.
what it looks like to me is that um, it turned out there could be a massive amount of progress made by doing essentially pure mathematics. And in the case of physics, the math far outstripped our ability to observe. And the kinds of tools you would need to observe the sorts of things that the math was pointing us to, as you say, the biggest lobby is because they needed the biggest, most expensive tools.
Right.
Right. So for cosmology, you need, the Hubble or newer generation space telescopes.
Yeah.
For particle physics, you need super colliders.
Yeah.
These are billion-dollar projects. Um, and in that case, though, what was interesting there is that the math came first, and it came first, I think, in part because there was a paucity of tools.
Hmm.
Um, and and so that led to a kind of unique development or trajectory, maybe. In biology, we've always had tools for data gathering ever since there's been biology,
Right.
right? And so
Right.
it was natural that it was a data-driven science from its outset.
Hmm.
And as our data, as we've gathered larger and larger sets of data, the complications that are hiding in that data has been showing itself, and it's pointing to the direction, that we need at least some number of people or some portion of our time to be stepping back and
Yeah.
thinking about all the stuff, all the data we've gathered so far and trying to make sense of it. But the pressures all point to doing the next experiment,
Right. But at the
right?
same time, the good news is that now with the open data environment and people being more transparent about the data, for those who are supported themselves, or by some way, they have access to really good data now than ever before to actually theorize.
Oh yeah. No, and I think it's one of the things, and they're not the only group, but certainly a gold star goes to the genetics community
Hmm.
as being a kind of an
Yeah, they
innovator and
were
early adopter
right.
of data sharing, knowing that what they had was, at the time, probably the most complex scientific question that we'd ever faced, figuring out how any genome, but how the human genome works.
Right.
And so committing from the very beginning to be sharing everything they found. Um, uh, and arguably, the brain is a more complex problem than that. We're a bit behind on the data sharing. We're getting there.
Right.
Um, but we're a bit behind on that. And yeah, I'd be again, I'd be interested to know, and I'm not even going to speculate on this, but what were the conditions that led to the genetics community to be really forward thinking
Hmm.
in setting up, if not publicly, at least widely
Right.
accessible databases of their findings very early on
Right.
in the progress in that field, whereas the neurosciences have generally lagged a bit behind on that.
Even
Um,
even molecular biology. So you read, Platt's strong inference article. I think it was 1968,
yeah.
and it was pretty like that was the first scientific article I read in my life. Uh, so one of my faculties gave me to read. And you see that 1968, so it's like about 60 years before, how advanced thinking was, and how even then, uh, the strong way to do science and falsifiability was actually giving rewards to one field over the other fields.
Mhm.
And he was especially critical of psychology and neuroscience even at that time.
Uh,
Yeah. So Gonzalez, you said that if at all we get to discuss representation, but I think representation is kind of for me, it's a holy grail of modern neuroscience. So I would love to, if we can discuss a little bit on representation because it gives a lot of background on where exactly you are going, and my own research program goes, and several of others. and how it has allowed to think us allows us to think about the brain in certain ways of cognition, as well as it has limited our thinking and has made us more data driven with a very kind of what- think about being in a very narrow bandwidth. So, what do you think? Like, is a representational assumption, and like why has it become a gospel? So I wanted you to touch on two things that we do not deny, that brain is not representational. We of course represent things. We have memories, we can do computations. But what is it when we criticize the representational idea of the brain and cognition that we are criticizing?
Yeah, so here again, this is a case where that word has an incredibly broad meaning, and stands for different things in different contexts for different people in different fields. One of the ongoing challenges for anyone who wants to bring together the work on this across different fields in philosophy and psychology and neuroscience and computer science is that the word is just used differently across those fields.
Hmm.
And the worst mistake anybody can make is the assumption that they're all saying the same thing.
Yeah.
And as it were, just stick together all the findings as if they're all true about representations. And they're all true about representations when that word is given the meaning it has in the subfield where the discovery was made. That doesn't mean it's true about some shared entity or concept.
Yeah.
So that's an ongoing challenge. We could start with what I guess would be universally agreed to, which is that the brain carries information, right?
Yeah.
Right, it carries information, so that right now you could, and we have now, as you know, technologies that would allow us to show this. My brain and its activity is carrying information about the scene I'm looking at, you in your office there, and in mine here, and right. So you could read off this scene from brain activity under the right circumstances. So the information is there. That's an absolutely crucial part of understanding how brains work and how they allow us to coordinate with our environments. So that's the baseline piece of agreement. The question from there is, well, then what?
Hmm.
Where do we go from there? What tools do we bring to bear on understanding brain activity and its contribution to ongoing behavior? The historically over the past 70-ish years, that answer has come from the computer revolution, which has a very particular set of answers to that question, right? So the way the computer revolution got sort of read into psychology was as a antidote to behaviorism. So behaviorism gets overread, I think, and treated as a kind of its own little dead end in psychology, as if it were a 30-year movement within psychology that then was killed off. Thank
Yeah.
goodness. That's really not true. First of all, behaviorism was and remains the study of how you relate contingencies in the environment, how you measure those and how you relate those contingencies to behavioral outputs. So contingencies in behavior, right? That was the foundation of Skinner's behavioral laws, right, of operant conditioning.
Yeah.
And it remains the mainstay of fields like behavioral economics.
Right.
Right. And that matters because you want to ask questions and answer questions like, well, what if we changed monetary policy in the following ways? What happens if when we change prices in the following sorts of ways? Or we change advertising and our messaging in particular? So you're changing the contingencies in the environment And that's going to change behavior. You don't have to know anything about psychological processes to do
Right.
this kind of work.
Right.
All you do is you write laws that relate environmental contingencies and variables to behavioral ones,
Right.
right? This is an incredibly important foundational discovery that you could do this, and it remains, central to various highly successful fields, animal behavior and behavioral economics among them. But and the brush it gets tarred with, the unfortunate one is that somehow the behaviors, at least the smart ones, were denying that there was a mind.
Hmm.
And so it was just kind of some kind of a black box that couldn't be studied, and certainly Skinner didn't think that. His claim was just, look, we have to leave ourselves what's observable, and let's do science within the constraints of what's observable. Now, that caution, of course, is important and ought to be kept in mind, but it's not tantamount to saying that there's no such thing as a brain, there's no such as a mind, excuse me, there's no such thing as experience, there's no such thing as consciousness. None of that follows from the methodological strictures that Skinner placed on himself in the field. But nevertheless, that chafed. And what what inspired a generation of folks in what came to be cognitive psychology, was the realization from computer science that programs were essentially, they sort of stood in for they could be understood to stand in for psychological processes. So you have the same input-output relations,
Mm-hmm.
and now you have two choices. You can write laws that relate the input to the output,
Yeah.
or you can say, okay, well, what processing steps might have led from one to the other, and what is that? Well, that's a program that relates inputs to outputs, and the inputs can be any sort of thing. It could be numbers, they can be, visual scenes, they can be whatever you
Yeah.
like, and the outputs can be more numbers, they could be other scenes, they can be behaviors of various kinds. But that input-output mapping, if it was reliably reproduced by a program, then the program becomes a kind of model for psychological processes.
Yeah.
And of course, a lot um, of the theorizing within computer theory, information theory, came into understanding how that would work. And so, and we inherit these terms, right? So we have storage, we've got formats, we've got processing steps, we've got algorithms. We talk about capacities, and we talk, right?
We have bandwidths, we have spectrums, we have,
Yeah.
yeah.
And so this incredibly useful vocabulary coming from computer theory, from computer science, got imported into psychology and started to be applied there. Okay, well, fine. So we know that if we show you a bunch of words, and then we manipulate certain aspects of those words, we can manipulate which ones you remember and which ones you don't. Okay, well, let's devise a kind of a theory of levels of processing that would account for those results. And we'll do that in terms of, in this case, sort of different kinds of storage and different kinds of accessibility and so on. So that's the legacy that we've inherited from the 50s and 60s. And it remains with us in that our focus is on representations understood as the sorts of things that are manipulated by computational processes that stand in for aspects of the environment, and that are amenable to sort of rule-based manipulation according to algorithms or whatnot. So those are information-carrying entities, but they're information-carrying entities of a very particular kind.
Yeah.
And of course, there's decades of debate within philosophy as exactly how to understand them, and what the actual requirements for something being a representation versus being something that's not quite a representation in that sense, right? So are tree rings representations?
Hmm.
Well, tree rings carry information about the age of the tree. So yes, in that sense, but not in the sense that they're amenable to or play a role in any kind of other, computational or mental process. So no, they have to, right? So there's been a massive amount of work along those lines. Um, the I guess I don't have any super deep critiques of representation, except to say that, in fact, the vast majority of the discoveries in the neurosciences, and even in the recent resurgence of work in artificial intelligence, right, which is interpreted in this representational sense, where the word representation is meant to have the same meaning as it has
Yeah.
in representational theory of mind, or in computational theory of mind, in fact, is much better understood in much simpler terms.
For instance,
Well, I mean, just for in the sense of these things contain information, um, uh, and that information can be understood in terms of driving processes,
right.
right? We'll have to think about it
Yeah. So
right.
why do we need to imply that actually the processes are manipulating representations when we can explain without that?
Yeah,
Right.
yeah. The the sorts of again, the sorts of strictures that well, let me actually come at it from the opposite side. The thing about computational theory of mind is that it's an incredibly powerful framework for thinking about input-output relations, right?
It is. Yeah.
It's too powerful. And you can see why that's a problem by looking precisely at the responses to the emerging movement of embodied cognition,
Right.
which is, oh, well, people had been theorizing that representations were sort of amodal symbols because the best computer science of the day was writing programs that use these amodal symbols that abstractly represented aspects of the world and then could be manipulated by sort of mathematical
Hmm.
or other kinds of algorithms. And so the stuff that's in the head is like that. And so you start looking for things that look like that. And then folks came along and said, well, yeah, but um, what about, so I'm thinking, say, of Larry Barsalou, just to pick a person at random. What about the fact that you're faster to process certain kinds of phrases when they have visual elements,
Hmm.
right? That aren't, super easy to understand in terms of abstract logical symbols. Well, that seems to indicate that, well, actually, no, maybe what's going on is there's some kind of simulation of visual experience. And it's the simulation of visual experience that somehow is being
It is.
used in this computational process. Um, and well, what are the people who push back? Well, okay, well, we can account for that
Yeah.
by saying, well, we have these different formats of representation, but they work just the same way as the other kinds. And so you can always, um, within the computational framework, you can always, my favorite is, well, yes, of course, the shape of your body and the size of your body and your particular, sensory endowments, all of that matters a great deal to how you slot yourself into the world. But all that means is we need to have a representation of the body in the brain.
So you're
So
touching
we'll
on
treat
a
everything the same, but now we have a representation of the body in the brain.
yeah.
It's like, well, you don't need that. You've got the body, right?
You have been I remember one podcast where you were there with three other people and you completely I would say you brutally slaughtered representations there. Uh, I think that was in some salon. But so here's the thing. So you touched on a very important aspect, which is the very idea that brain operates or manipulates representations that can be posed as a hypothesis. Is it a falsifiable hypothesis?
Um, it is if you state at the outset what you mean by that term,
Okay.
right? If you put strictures on the meaning of that term, um, and then you run your experiments, um, then then yes, and in fact, it's been falsified multiple times
Right.
over decades.
Exactly.
But as soon as that happens, people
Yeah.
change the terms under which
Change the terms.
they use the right. So, another famous one is the work on mental rotation,
Hmm.
Steve Koslin and others. Okay, well, if we have these amodal symbols and that's what we work with, let's compare complex shapes. And we'll ask people whether these shapes are the same or they're different in space. And well, what's the strategy people use? Well, it turns out they simulate rotating one to the other and seeing if it matches. Now, there's all kinds of fascinating issues about imagination and how that works that get raised by this work. But one thing it shows pretty clearly is that these aren't amodal symbols, right, that are somehow being translated into some common format
Oh.
and then compared. No, you're using visual imagination,
Hmm.
and you're applying visual imagination to your visual representation, again, now small r representation of the two objects that are being shown to you. And you're imagining one rotating into the plane of the other, and then you can see whether they fit or not. Well, you can force that into oh, that's just a representation with a particular format, and the algorithm is, some kind of translational, rotational an algorithm. And so not everything's untouched in representational
Right.
theory of mind. No, it isn't, right? You've discovered something really important
Hmm.
about the ways in which elements of basic experience drive
Right.
processes.
In fact,
Um,
yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
no,
In fact, by arguing that, you are basically calling a homunculus who's deciding, like, oh, it's like the shape matching challenge of complex objects. So these are the kind of representations I need to bring in, these are the kind of, computations I need to bring in.
right. Yeah, and so again, this is where why that word representation has taken on so many different meanings across lots of different
Hmm.
uh, intellectual endeavors, because that's sort of what you have to do. And the most respectable game in town remains the representational one, and so everyone just talks that way, even though they're in fact investigating really disparate phenomena that if we paid attention to the differences, we'd probably learn a lot more
Right.
than when we talk about them as if they're the same.
So
So
it's kind of a,
imagination being one that I'm
yeah,
just started to be super interested in. Um, so that's got to be representational in some sense of that term,
yeah.
but it's pretty clearly representational in a way that's different from, it's certainly different, although it has some similarities with visual experience.
Oh,
It's also different from what they call motor imagery, right? Which has a very different character from what we call imagination, even though we use that same word image in both
yeah.
cases.
Hmm.
And so there are all these really fascinating aspects of our experience that we can study if we're willing to take it on its own terms. And only once we've done that in a serious way, then try to bring it all together and
Right.
relate it in some larger functioning whole.
Right.
But assuming we figured that out at the beginning,
Yeah.
oh, it's all this representational theory of mind, and then just fit everything into that, that just papers over the important differences. And,
Hmm.
and that's where it starts to limit progress, I think.
Right. It doesn't allow us to think, of the next hypothesis as well, because so this happens, you read neuroscience articles and you want to look for some novelty, but the novelty is just on the data or the system or the task. It's very hard to find something, especially the hardcore neuroscience where like, oh, eureka, we have discovered something. Even the mechanism, because representations hide mechanism. You can attribute any damn process to representation,
Yep.
right?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And this is an old point, right? This is the stuff coming out of the dynamic systems folks. And the Watt governor. There's a reason that the Watt governor has been used again and again and again by the folks on as it were my side of the aisle as a kind of exemplar, which is, well, yeah, you could talk about the Watt governor in terms of it representing the speed of the engine that is trying to control where the angles, the angles of the arms on the
Yeah.
governor represent the speed and the weights and the length of the, you could talk about it in representational terms, yeah, and you won't be wrong in the sense that you won't get the right input-output relations, but that's not an apt description of what's happening there, which is best captured in terms of the physics of the situation. And it's the physics that's been captured. That's why the design is so clever, right? It just relies on aspects of the underlying physics and the rules of inertia. And it's those things that get captured in the design of this very clever governor.
Yeah.
And the representational explanation is just immaterial to that. And I think that sort of it's not that we've been great at coming up with examples as clear as that in every case, but mental rotation and all of the not the excuse me the work on how we process tools differently from the way we process the animals, differently from the way we process fruits and vegetables. None of that fits neatly within a representational theory mind as its overarching glue, but it fits very nicely in a kind of a evolutionary story where what animals evolved to do is to be able to deal with
Mm.
the opportunities and the challenges that the world presents it, and it comes up with strategies and mechanisms. It evolves mechanisms and develops strategies for dealing with those things. And the successful ones, get applied across multiple circumstances. When those circumstances are relevantly similar to the ones in which those strategies or mechanisms were originally developed.
Right.
That's well, that I think that's a much better, more fruitful way to think your way through this thicket than the representational gloss that we tend to put over top of it.
And there's so much of cognitive dissonance as well. Like, for instance, my phone's microprocessor, when I buy this and throw it off, after a few years, it's the same. But the human brain is not, I mean, even if you look at the map and the structure, it's not the same even like 10 minutes later. So for such a thing in flux, we attribute these constant properties which computation demands or representation demands is it's just absurdity, to be honest. I mean, it's hard unless you are like kind of uh, mind-washed or cultish about it. It's very hard to imagine like why would somebody believe that, because that itself is like a proof, your own experience, that can't be true. So that brings
Yeah,
me, yeah,
again, it's because, and this is generally the case, the representational theory of mind, or the computational theory of mind, is an incredibly powerful framework.
yeah.
And so people try to hold on to it because it's also true that if you give up on that, we're sort of at sea in
Uh,
terms of how what frameworks we need to really bring to bear.
so
Um,
maybe there's not a universally accepted framework yet, but we have to. I mean, you need to leave a coast to reach the other coast, right? And there will be time and probably long times when you will be in sea. But if you
yeah,
don't leave the coast, there's no way you are going to find new island.
yeah. No, I'm with you, but not everyone is comfortable with that, right?
Right, right, right.
I gave a talk on this stuff, and I won't say where it was because
Yeah,
then people will try to guess who the people I'm talking about were. But I gave a talk on this
yeah.
sort of thing. And at the end of the talk, two people in the front row, they both sat back at the same time. And simultaneously, one said, awesome. And the other said, shit.
Yeah.
And they look at each other, and I'm witnessing this because I'm right in front of them, and says, what do you mean awesome?
Mhm.
Don't you understand? This means we have to start over.
Right.
And the other person says, yeah, isn't it awesome?
Yeah.
And that's the two attitudes.
That's like a grant review.
Yeah, yeah.
Right.
Yeah, it's not a coincidence that just before getting on this call with you, I was writing a grant.
Okay. Yeah, so that's nice. So Professor Anderson, that brings me to the idea of the unit of analysis.
Yeah,
So when we talk about the neuroscience, we talk about neural activity, a neuron firing or not firing. When you look at any neural data, for the most part, it is neural activity, yes or no, like a binary state, right? And we can talk about rate, we can talk about, the difference in between interspike events and things like that. So we can calculate, different variables out of that neural activity. Different neuroimaging techniques, especially at a single neuron level, whether it's optogenetics or other single two photon, they are mostly trying to look at neural activity, either chemically or by measuring uh, the electrical properties. So now the question is that is it a good assumption that that's actually the unit of analysis? Because I had been feeling that we started thinking of neural activity as a unit of analysis because we could record from it to begin with, because
Mm.
electricity was available and we could actually record for single neuron. Ultimately, it's a chemical mush. Is it even remotely possible that all the neural activity can be just an epiphenomena which might not have directly to do with cognition or how the brain operates? It might be everything in the chemical domain or some other domain which we have not yet tapped into. And it is our technologies right now which give us a lens that this is how it operates.
Hmm. Yeah, I don't know how to answer that question directly, I don't think. Um, and in part, that's because I guess what I want to ask you is when you are looking for a unit of analysis, are you imagining that what we're going to discover is the lowest level, either operation or entity that we need to discover, out of which everything else can be built? So, like the periodic table.
Kind of, yes.
So the question is there, so obviously there are particles that are smaller than atoms, right?
Right.
And so the periodic table tells us uh, about the elements, the atomic elements. There are smaller things, and of course there are bigger things, molecules and so on.
Hmm.
But that gives us a unit um, that we can do at least some things with. Um, so way to ask the question then is there something like a periodic table for neuroscience? I don't know, and I'm not sure how useful it would be if there were. So I guess I don't know that the people who did this work thought of it this way. Some of it was driven by either straight up computational or straight up anatomical considerations. But a lot of work has been done trying to classify different kinds of neuron types,
Yeah.
right? So you've got Purkinje cells and starburst cells and basically classifying these things in terms of gross anatomy. Um, and that's important, right? Because it's
Of
clearly the
course.
case that the I'll call them computational properties, but just call them the communication properties
Yeah.
of these neurons are going to differ based on their shape,
Completely.
right? And so
Yeah.
that matters quite a bit. Now, does that mean that you can, if you know you have a particular mix of different kinds of cell types, it's going to allow you to predict mechanistic
I
outputs?
mean, one
Probably not, right?
one can argue that that's the same as like a GPU having a different architecture than like a CPU,
Yeah,
right? But ultimately, the level at which computation is happening is still the binary bits. So you have different, geometries of different cells in the brain and different clusters of neurons. But that is just to privilege certain kind of computation over the other kind.
yeah,
But the unit of analysis still remains the spike.
yeah. But then you've got, from coming from the other side, Olaf Sporns and folks like this, talk about motifs,
Yeah.
right? And so these are really highly abstract graph level shapes.
Hmm.
So a triangle is a real simple motif, an interconnected triangle, and you can have a hub and spoke,
Yeah.
and you can have, a chain, and you can put these things together. And the motifs are, also give you a kind of elemental unit of analysis from which you can build various kinds of
Right, right.
devices.
Yeah.
And again, I don't know how good the analogy is between that and um, other, the periodic table.
So
We
the
know quite a
question,
bit about the elements and their properties. And in some cases, hydrocarbons is where we've probably made our biggest strides. We can start to predict molecular properties
Mhm.
from the shape of the atomic, right?
Right,
How
right,
the atoms get bound together and what they are,
right.
right? Hydrogen, carbon, oxygen, and so on.
Definitely.
Um, but we're really a far long way of being able to predict much more than that, and not much at all outside of a very small class of molecules.
So is it a good assumption that there can be a particular scale of analysis, or there can be a particular scale at will, if you understand that particular scale, it can be motifs, it can be meta motifs, or it can be networks, or it can be something at some level which will help us understand, let's say, intention.
Hmm.
And then you have, people like Stuart Hoffman who would argue that it's at the quantum level, inside at the that's just another level and another time scale at which, the argument has been about where exactly things are happening in the brain. So, okay, it's a great question. I myself am not sure, what I want to ask here because the time scale of at which we look at are very has magnitudes of orders, difference, as well as the spatial scale at which we can look for instance, from neuroreceptors
Hmm.
to the level of spikes. It's very different spatially.
Yeah. I mean, another way of thinking about unit of analysis, and this comes from a different analogy, not the chemical one, but biological, is to talk about the cell, right, as the building block of the organism. Why
Mhm.
would choose the cell? Well, because it's demarcated from other cells. It's got properties that can be studied in isolation. Once we understand those things, we can think about how they interact.
Mhm.
That doesn't give us a massive amount of predictive power as we scale up, right?
Yeah, it is not.
But it nevertheless does give us a baseline. Um, and it gives us a theory. Everything that has certain kinds of characteristics is composed of these things.
Mhm.
Um, I don't know that we have or need a similar thing in neuroscience, right?
No, we do
Is
not.
everything that can think composed of motifs?
No.
Um, Probably not, right? Um, and yeah, so I don't know what work a unit of analysis is going to do for us. Obviously, you adopt one for any given project, right? You have
Mhm.
pragmatic reasons for choosing. I'm studying networks and I'm studying network dynamics, and I'm studying network dynamics because I'm really interested in epilepsy.
Mhm.
Um, and so I want to know what the tipping points are, or what the critical points are for a particular kind of series of network activations. And if I can figure out what those things are, I can maybe come up with devices to interrupt epileptic seizures before they happen without doing massive damage to the brain through surgeries, right?
Right.
Which we want to avoid.
So,
So
so,
yeah,
uh,
so for
uh,
particular kinds of applications, a unit
so here we are. I
just
think
itself.
we talked about the end goal, in the beginning without defining the end goal. So, is it that there is no end goal of neuroscience except the end goal which a researcher decides? Because what exactly is the question? Like, what exactly are, as a neuroscientist in general, we all are trying to find? We all have different end goals, right? In that sense.
Yeah.
And then it is justified to use, or to propose whatever theory and whatever assumptions which lead to that end goal, correct or not?
Um, yeah, well, so can you give me an example of an end goal for any other?
Just like you mentioned, for instance. I mean, the other end goal can be, for instance, a lot of fMRI work, for instance. At one point, it is highly flawed, in terms of not being able to capture the time scale of activations and having delays and the coarse graining and a lot of things which go into fMRI. The person is not even, attending posture, but at the same time, it has given us a lot of insights about disease, for instance, or
Mhm.
the effect of medication and other things. A lot of utility has come out of that work. It might not be true to how the brain operates as a technique, and it's probably one of the most inaccurate technique to think about the brain. But so if we define our end goal as those benefits, or if we go towards, if we go with a more utilitarian approach, I think then we can justify every of our choices, like which a lot of sciences do, in biomedical sciences. So do you think neuroscience is that kind of a science, and it is not something at the level of understanding, the basic laws of nature? We should we should start by assuming that it's a different kind of science
Mhm.
than understanding the universe or the nature of the universe, and then we are okay, um, and
Yeah.
we are satisfied with these limitations, rather than starting to equate it with those kind of sciences, hard sciences, and then being dissatisfied that we do not have the end goal, or we do not have a proper method, or assumptions are wrong. Is Yeah.
Yeah, I guess I'm struggling with trying to understand anything outside of physics having an end goal of that sort. And even physics is a little bit fraught, right? So we want a grand unified theory
Hmm.
that brings together relativity and quantum theory. And that's going to mean what? A kind of consistent mathematical treatment of, well, what in the end is a fairly limited range of phenomena. And obviously, it'd be an awesome achievement to
Hmm.
get there. Um, but you're still thinking about the kinds of laws of motion and decay and um, right, which if you think about all the things in the world you might measure, you're looking at a really small subset of those things that can be
Hmm.
related by these laws. Even chemistry, the search space is going to be much bigger than that, right? Um, So, I guess I don't think this way. I don't think in terms of ultimate end goals, right?
Hmm.
So, but if I were to respond to this, I'd say, I'm a big fan of approximate goals. And so, even when those proximate goals turn out to succeed in the narrow formulation and fail in the broad. So, the Human Genome Project is an example of this, right? The proximal goal was to map the human genome,
Yeah.
right? And it succeeded in the narrow goal, right, of finding the base pairs, and some of the very human variations in those, right, and identifying uh, a lot of common genes across individuals, and that make up the human species and its diversity.
Hmm.
But in succeeding in that, it failed in its larger goal because the thought was going to be there would be some kind of really neat, if not one-to-one, fairly
Yeah.
tractable mapping between genes and phenotypes. And that's just turned out not to be the case. Now, the fact that it's turned out not to be the case has generated massive amounts of really impressive and interesting science that will itself eventually lead to all kinds of both, you know, intellectual and practical achievements.
Yeah.
But it nevertheless failed. He was motivated by that goal,
Hmm.
and it nevertheless failed to live up to it, mostly because it turned out the system they were studying was way more complex
Complex.
than was initially thought. That's a success in a different sense, right?
Hmm.
It opened up a new vista
Yeah.
exploration. So I'm a fan of those kinds of proximal goals, and I think we kind of passed a milestone like that in the neurosciences, where and fMRI played a big role in this, where the idea was to map the human brain
Yeah.
in
Which
something
is
like the same way. Yeah,
right.
right. Well, hence phrenology, for the both of us, right,
Yeah.
are glomming onto that term for the same sort of reason, because it represents a kind of a proximal goal of mapping the human brain and discovering the relationships between, as it were, neurotypes and behavioral
Hmm.
outputs, right?
Right.
And now we've done a really great job, and it's not complete because it can't be complete in the same way the genome was, but even that, there there's more room of variation in the human brain than there is in the human genome.
Hmm.
But the human brain has been really thoroughly mapped. with psychological processes. But that very effort led to the realization that, oh gosh, every individual bit is more complicated than we initially thought.
Yeah.
Now we gathered those data under that assumption, and that provided an immense amount of insight. But that very same project that led to that sort of mapping is what led to the next step, which is okay, well, no, we've got to go one level above that in complexity.
Hmm.
And that's sort of where we're at now. Hence the talk about networks and motifs and dynamic processes, because that one-to-one mapping
And
of function to structure just isn't realistic.
so can you predict the next watershed movement would, same kind of movement for this network or the current paradigm now?
I predict no. I mean, I can tell you. So one of the we've talked about mechanism at a number of points in this conversation, and of course that's a going concern in neuroscience too,
Hmm.
mostly at lower levels of organization, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's going to proceed apace. So, we've got really good mechanistic handle on the operation of the neuron. And here, of course, we're also discovering the complexities, right? So neurons interact with the glial cells, they interact with the intracellular milieu in various ways that haven't been super understood because we mostly studied neurons, in culture when we could do it. So the action potential really well mapped out, super important scientific discovery. And so we have a really good sense of that mechanism. Put it back inside a brain, and gosh, its behavior becomes a lot more complex.
Hmm.
Okay, great. Let's just start tackling that complexity. It's now you're talking about network dynamics and what the mechanisms for that are. I've started to think about this notion of constraint with the notion that, well, maybe one way to get a handle on higher order processes is not to try to build them up from lower level ones, but to think about the constraints under which the system operates and which constraints can be brought to bear and which are brought to bear under different circumstances. That may be one place where, if not universal laws, again, that seems a bit beyond us at the moment, but one place where we can get some principles that apply across various contexts in terms of the kinds of constraints that both enable and prevent particular kinds of activities.
Mhm.
And so understanding things on the level of constraint might offer, a kind of a high level window onto the complexity of the operation of the system. That going strictly bottom up is not going to get us. That's not a
So,
prediction so much as a
yeah,
commitment to a particular
right.
line of work.
So on that note, is Phrenology principle a principle where A, it has the components, the required components to be a principle of that kind, and B, it has that principled, formulation which such a principle should have. Uh, to be honest, I personally find a lot of fundamental flaws both from the assumptions side as well as from the application side of it. And I know
Mhm.
people from your research group have published pretty scientific criticisms of that principle, but that principle has taken over the scientific community by storm, as if we were just waiting for that one uh, principle for decades. And it has been applied, through like any kind of data, basically, in a very, what should I say, in a very vague fashion. So what's your view on such a principle?
Um, I mean, my knee-jerk view is skepticism
Hmm.
of any attempt to bring really high-level principles like entropy reduction or free energy reduction, maximization, and use it to explain systems across all kinds of spatial and temporal scales. I just I guess I don't quite fathom the kind of hedgehog you have to be to think that that's a viable
Yeah.
right. Why would you start there?
In fact,
Um,
one, yeah.
it I mean, I think of it as, and these things are important to think about. What's important about this is it's another entree into the question of what the relationship between biology and physics is,
Hmm.
right? So what are biological organisms are physical entities as well. So what are the physical principles that are most important to biological ones
Yeah.
that are taken advantage of in biological organisms, um, or manipulated by them, captured by them, that can help us explain both the organization and the behaviors of biological systems. I think from that standpoint, phrenology is a really important thing to be looking at. Um, but for some of the same reasons that I am skeptical of, the notion that representation means the same thing across all the various systems and contexts it's deployed in. I feel like there are so many obvious differences between kinds of systems and levels of analysis here that starting with this ambition to unify them all is inevitably going to blind you to those important differences,
The
right?
scales are also very important because you can have, even like, let's say maximization, optimization, or reduction at one scale, which can actually be antithesis to the maximization, reduction, or optimization of other scales that can actually increase or decrease. So the scale blindness, or wrapping up everything into just one entity is also a mistaken belief.
Yeah. And, there are people who like this way of thinking. And, I pled earlier for a diversity of funding approaches, right? Let's fund data collection. Let's also fund
Yeah.
um, theoretical work. And I think I didn't say this out loud, but I will now. We also ought to be funding much more exploration
Mhm.
than we are now, as opposed to, I mean, exploration as opposed to exploitation. So walking down the paths that we know have been productive versus trying something new that might fail. I
Right.
think we're not in balance there either. And so in the light of that, I think, yeah, people should investigate free energy principle.
Mhm.
And they should investigate it however makes most sense to them intellectually.
Mhm.
Um, but this same thing happened and is still happening with natural selection.
Mhm.
Right, here's this really big idea
Yeah.
devised in order to explain the variation and the emergence of species. Let's apply it to everything,
Huh.
right? So Edelman's neuronal selection hypothesis. Okay, we're going to apply natural selection also to brain development.
Mhm.
Well, there are all kinds of really interesting phenomena about brain development that just aren't captured by a principle at that level, except in a really superficial way,
Mhm.
right? And if you so, and yes, it's true that by analogy, some cells survive and some cells don't, and so there's a culling and there's a change in
Yeah.
organization amongst the really, yeah, okay, but how much deeper than that does that analogy go? Not
Right.
very, I don't think.
Right.
But it's the same sort of mentality that leads to this postulation of free energy as the thing that's going to unlock the mystery.
Mhm.
And I mean, the most pessimistic thing I can say here is that we're nowhere near being ready to unlock the mystery or even to recognize when we've done so.
Mhm.
And applying the free energy principle in this really generalizing way is not going to help us get there.
Yeah.
I'm not, and by the way, that's not saying it's not going
Yeah.
to turn out to be the thing at the end.
Yeah.
It's saying that even if it is the thing at the end, we're not in a position to know that.
Right.
And starting with that is not going to help us know that, not for a very long time
Mhm.
of gathering data and testing hypotheses that are all going to be of necessity far more localized than that.
Right.
But
Your video has just stopped.
I hit a button on my
Oh, I see.
keyboard. Sorry
Sorry.
about that. Yeah.
So, I often think that how much innovation at the funding level, at the grant agencies level, can actually promote science in multiple ways. So, for instance, you can have, an innovation where if you are hell-bent on your hypothesis, like very risky, very ambitious, idea, at the same time, and because if we keep a lot of funding to risky and crackpotty looking ideas, then there will be like an epidemic of crackpotty ideas, right?
Yeah.
But if you put a penalty on that, let's say, or a cost to that, that will fund the riskiest of the idea or like some theory on a salary cut basis. So those who are the most passionate, like I'm so passionate about my theory that I'm willing to take a personal risk,
Mm.
okay, to get that fund to be able to support, this risky hypothesis of mine, right? And then suddenly you might get a lot of people who are actually or are the most people in the most good faith about their work, right? Because they have skin in the game. So I think if at the grant level, otherwise, why would somebody venture out to do some things, which is a liability, then again. So I think bringing in some skin in the game at the sociological level of science can enhance the quality and exploration in science much more.
Yeah. Yeah. One of my PhD advisors
Yeah.
suggested that um, every person who wanted to publish a scientific article
Hmm.
should take a pay cut because it would
That
force
case,
them to be so passionate about getting that idea out there.
so in that case, I'll get a lot of reduction in my salary, but I'll take a cut because I've often, there were times when there was no fund available, even during my, when I was I was a PhD student, I was willing to put my own, salary to pay the
Yeah.
APC, which finally I discovered that, it's not a good idea. People told me, but I was willing. So I agree with you. I agree.
Well, and it's worth keeping in mind that
Yeah,
we're not necessarily talking about a lot of money.
yeah. I mean, even $100, per
Well, maybe more than
publication.
$100, but
Yeah.
a lot of the work I did
Mhm.
was at Franklin and Marshall College,
Mhm.
which is a small school, a kind of a powerhouse for its size, for sure. But
Yeah.
we're not routinely bringing in multi-million dollar grants at that
Yes.
institution,
Yes.
right? Nevertheless, we were pretty well funded across the board, and we were able to explore a lot of ideas that would have been much harder to explore if the expectation was you were bringing in multi-million dollar grants all the time.
Right. Right.
And so a model that balanced out a little bit, I think, better than maybe we do right now,
Hmm.
exploration, um, you know, at the
Yeah.
$100,000 level rather than the $1 million level,
Yeah.
I think would, think of it like angel investing if you want, or right,
I completely
or
agree with you. Yes.
early Silicon
Yeah.
Valley stuff. You invest in a
Yeah.
bunch of ideas, knowing that a lot of them are
Right.
going to fail,
Right.
but the amount you're investing compared to the reward is so favorable over the whole portfolio
Right.
that you're willing to do it, and that kind of mentality would I think be super useful to import into sciences. Now, again, most science is funded by government agencies, and
Yeah.
they're right. They have to uh, answer to the
Hmm.
politicians that
Yeah.
give them the funds and them to the people, and whereas venture capital is all private. So there are constraints that are quite different across
So
these.
now here I would say so for instance, like NIH in the US for R01, it funds like up to 2.5 to $3 million, even more, for a grant for 5 years. I know so many projects that people applied and got funded, which did not need that much of money. Just because the grant itself is in this kind of zone of funding,
Mhm.
people make up the budget. Most of the budgets are made up. Okay. Because there is that much of money in the grant, right? So instead of that, and that leads to a lot of misuse or overuse and things like that. So instead of that, if I get endowed, if an IIH or like any grant agency endows me with $2.5 million as an assistant professor,
Yeah.
that will give me $200,000 of return for the next, perpetuity to my career, right? Almost.
Yep.
I can do much more with that $200,000 and be more secure about the next, money coming in and do a much more, honest, creative, and utilitarian work than constantly searching for that little money.
Yeah.
and playing all sorts of games which people play, and people who reject to play those games sometimes not get funded, their lives.
Yeah.
So
No, I
yeah,
hear the argument for sure. And I, I even agree with you. It's worthwhile playing devil's advocate here,
yeah,
which is, so Howard Hughes does something similar to that. They identify people they think are really
yeah,
promising.
hmm,
Um, and they just give them a lot of money over a very long period of time for them to do
yeah,
foundational exploratory work.
yeah.
I think that's fantastic. The inevitable question is, well, why'd you choose those people? How did that person end up with that funding? And then you end up with, and the system we have now is not largely, but is in part designed to answer those questions in a more direct way, which is, well, that person had to compete for that funding every 3 years
Hmm,
for their entire career. So they got it because they came out on top of a
hmm,
selection process that was rigorous. And
yeah,
now we all know about the problems with the selection process in and
yeah,
of
of
itself.
course. Yeah,
Um, but you point to the mechanisms there of that's the way of ensuring that we're spending our money in a wise way by
yeah,
requiring people to submit, as it were, to evaluation on a frequent basis. The
hmm,
trouble, as you have said, and I totally agree with you, is that limits your ambition to projects that you can plausibly say
or
that you're
renew.
going to make progress on over the course of a really short period of time.
Right. Or renew, because it's much easier to renew grants than actually apply for new grants. So that itself has a incentivizes, rotten or exploitative work than actually new work within your own career.
Yep.
Right.
Yeah. So there's no perfect solution to that problem,
Yeah.
but hence that's why I advocate for diversity of approaches.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Diversity of
let's have this kind of grant and that kind of grant and this sort of support, and
right.
let's explore this theory and that theory, and
Hmm.
um, let's try to do as much of it as we can,
Right.
um, all at the same time. And right now, for various reasons, we're overly focused on data collection and overly focused on near-term
Mm.
success.
Right.
And you're right that we need ways, whatever those turn out to be, to uh, to support more theoretical work and more long-term projects than we're good at supporting right now.
Okay. So coming back to, the core science of our conversation. So you talked about in your book neural reuse and functional localization, right? The neural reuse hypothesis. Could you give a little overview of the neural hypothesis and then address some of the criticisms of that theory? Because there are pockets in neuroscience who think that that is actually that's not like I would say a stride forward, is actually a remarketing of the same concept. So I personally feel that it's a huge stride, but one can argue that okay, the problem which people face is often not being able to distinguish from typical neuroplasticity.
Yeah. Yeah. So in the simplest formulation of neural reuse is that over and against the notion that each part of the brain is dedicated to a particular process.
Yeah.
So back of the brain is visual processing, and memory is largely
Hmm.
in sort of the middle of the brain, metatemporal areas, and executive control is up here, and so on and so forth. Language localized to one
Almost
part.
every textbook. Yes.
Yeah. So the textbook story. In Now, just empirically speaking, if you do a single experiment, it can look like that because the brain differentially activates depending on the circumstances it's put into,
Hmm.
right? So you can find the evidence of that differential activation. And then you attribute the difference to the differences between your experimental and control condition. And you think, oh, that's what's responsible for my experimental condition.
Yeah.
The work that I've done has said, okay, yeah, I get it. But instead of looking at one experiment at a time, let's look at a few thousand at a time.
Hmm.
So you put all this into a big database and you run analysis scripts on this. And then it turns out that this piece of the brain that you thought was dedicated to vision, in fact, is involved in mathematics, it's involved in spatial cognition, it's involved in um, uh, navigation, it's involved. I mean, you could just start naming psychological processes,
Yeah.
uh, and any piece of the brain is involved in many, many, many of them.
Hmm.
And a lot of the work I've done has been devising ways to actually quantify that and capture it and in various ways, and to explain why that would be, why certain parts of the brain are more diverse than other parts, more functionally diverse than other parts. I think the overwhelming message coming out of analyses of existing data is that every part of the brain, nearly every part of the brain, is highly multifunction. Right, so that's the reuse. So something that's developed under one circumstance or came to achieve a particular capacity ends up being useful across multiple circumstances, and so it's reused across those multiple circumstances.
Hmm.
And the difference between each of these circumstances isn't as part necessarily in which individual parts of the brain are being used, but in terms of the partnerships that are set up,
Hmm.
right? So this part of the brain does one thing when it's doing a visual task, but it's talking with a different set of partners when it's doing a spatial task, and a different set of partners when it's doing a mathematical task, right? So it's offering something to the team, as it were.
Right.
Um, um, but it's used across multiple contexts. That's the fundamentals of the reuse
Yeah.
concept. Now, you mentioned neuroplasticity. That's a different thing. That's a temporal phenomenon that says that, well, say your brain, well, certainly overdevelopment. Let's talk about brain damage, because that comes up quite frequently.
Yeah.
So you have a stroke, and you're immediately impaired. You can't move your right arm because you had a left hemisphere stroke. Well, you eventually recover that function. Well, the stroke killed off many, many, many cells in the brain. It's not those that end up controlling your arm when you regain function.
Hmm.
It's some other part of the brain that does that.
Yeah.
That's plasticity. It's massively important. It's important across the entire lifespan and not just in response to injuries, right? It's what allows you to learn new things.
Hmm.
It's what allows your brain to develop to tackle new challenges. That never goes away. Reuse is a different thing, which is that even when you've got relatively stable sets of connections between neurons and a relatively stable subset of neurons that are involved in a particular process, that same subset of neurons is used under different circumstances for different things.
Yeah.
That's distinct from this plasticity. So I call it a form of neuroplasticity because, of course, the analogy is obvious. But it's a form of neuroplasticity that allows the brain to adjust over very short timescales, behavioral timescales, to deploy the right resources for the task at hand. And that's going to involve often using the same pieces that it used under a different set of circumstances or set of behavioral demands.
Yeah.
But in a different combination or with a different set of partners. So that's a new kind of principle of neural deployment, and it's different from plasticity, and certainly different from functional localization.
Hmm. Okay. And what are the implications? So once we embrace reuse hypothesis, like have you seen changes in how people actually started investigating their neuroscientific questions, as well as how bringing in the body into the play, like
Yeah, no,
the
I
embodied
mean,
perspective.
this was certainly not the only motivating factor, but it's certainly amongst the motivating factors that push people into studying networks and network dynamics,
Hmm.
right? Because then
Yeah.
it becomes clear that the action is not going to be at, getting better and better at localizing things
Hmm.
to one piece of the brain. It's going to be trying to figure out, okay, what's talking to what, what's interacting with what at
Right.
different times and under different circumstances. That's really going to be, and that's kind of where we're at right now. And except in a few areas where it's turned out that, and this is true, right? Auditory cortex turns out to be pretty specialized. for reasons that aren't necessarily well understood, but it's pretty specialized. So if you're studying hearing, you can really focus on only a few parts of the brain, and you're
Yeah.
going to be fine studying that. And you can divide neuroprosthetic devices to help with those. And so you've got a really nice target there. For most other behavioral and cognitive functions, you're going to have to be looking at much broader networks of interacting partners. And so that was one of the things that changed things in that direction, even though there were certainly other motivating factors.
Right.
Um, Now there are still some hangovers, right? People still tend to talk about the fusiform face area as being dedicated to faces, and the parahipic or
I mean, it's partly also because how they're named, like in a typical textbook, when you look at the names of those areas,
yeah,
it promotes, those hangovers.
it does. And sometimes there is hangovers from um yeah, when they were initially discovered, it was under those circumstances, and so it got that name. But part of it is there remains an attachment to this
Yeah.
single function hypothesis. It's nice in the sense that it's simple, it's straightforward. Um, so, some work um, takes takes the work that I've done and others have done seriously, but says, but what we can conclude from that is not that the areas in question are multifunctional, it's that we don't understand the function they're actually dedicated to.
Hmm.
Right. So what we really need to do is understand the function. And once we have the right set of functions,
Yeah.
then it'll become clearer to us what the mapping turns out to be. Um, I don't think that's going to be successful,
Hmm.
but it's a certainly respectable move in light of the data.
Right.
Right. The non-respectable move is just to deny it. Well, there's a problem with
Hmm.
the data,
Yeah.
so we're going to ignore that set of findings. And
Hmm.
some people have taken that tack. But if you really want to hold on to the organization of the brain being marked by a localization of function,
Hmm.
well, you've got to find a way around these data. And the way around it, one way around it, is to say, well, um, it's because we have the wrong set of psychological functions.
Hmm.
Once we have the right ones, then the mess will clean itself up.
Right.
Um, and I doubt that's going to turn out to be true. It is, by the way, where I sort of started with this,
Hmm.
with the notion that you could identify low-level computational functions that just turned out to be useful across a range of circumstances. So yes, the psychological level was not the right level, was not correct.
Yeah.
But some low-level computational one might be. And then as I've gotten deeper into the uh, anatomical and physiological weeds on this, that just looks very implausible to me that that's going to be the answer.
On that note, I'll mention my own experience. So it was like 4 years back, my mother called me and we were talking, and she mentioned that my father was using TV remote uh,
Mhm.
to put on his eyes as glasses.
Okay.
And as soon as she told me that, and I was a neuroscience student, and from that localized, idea, I figured out that there's definitely wrong something with the left frontal cortex.
Yeah.
It turned out that he had a secondary carcinogen in his left frontal cortex. He was using different objects for different uses.
Mhm.
He had apraxia because of the tumor. We had got his radiation therapy, and finally his cognition was. Uh, he was functional now. He could identify objects, and he was doing well. A few months later, his condition deteriorated. We admitted him to the hospital, and he was in coma.
Mm.
And one of the neurosurgeons attributed that coma to that tumor. But the tumor had been there for last 9 months, and the edema, because the tumor had been like fluctuating less and more, over that time. So we went for a secondary option, a secondary, prescription. And the other doctor said, like, no, tumor had been there. There might be something else. So they did all the blood profiles, like every test they could do on him to figure out what can be wrong. And his endocrinologist, or maybe one of the doctors in the team, said, like, let's check his blood ammonia level.
Hmm.
And it turns out that blood ammonia is not a regular practice in checking because it's mostly, moderate. They found that it was super toxic level of blood ammonia because some problem with the liver. So they just gave him some simple granules to extract ammonia from his blood.
Hmm.
It took a week and he was completely back. So it was just the blood ammonia level which rose, led to deteriorations, especially made those symptoms attached to that tumor worse, and then finally complete coma.
Yeah.
And to take it away, and the brain is completely functional. So how much brain work, how much metabolic, factors affect the brain function and so distributed, it's very hard to understand and to
Yeah.
map out.
Oh, absolutely. And one of the more fascinating developments of the past couple of decades has been the brain-gut connection,
Yeah,
right? All the microbiome work in our gut bacteria and how that affects, mood and cognition, and
right.
it's fascinating. And certainly does point towards looking at things in a much more holistic way
Hmm.
than the kind of, hyperlocalization that we tend to favor, at
Right.
least as a first pass in most of the sciences. And so one really open question from the reuse perspective is, what are the mechanisms for modulation that allow for the rapid switching between different kinds of coalitions in the brain? That's an important question to answer, and I don't have an answer to it. I
Right.
know that there are lots of different mechanisms that might be involved. So spine twitching, these global things like just intercellular and blood levels of various chemicals, all those things can change the propensity of one part of the brain to interact with another part of the brain.
Yes.
Which ones are involved under which circumstances? Don't know. But those are the kind of questions you start wanting to ask when, instead of thinking about localizing function to a particular region, you're
Hmm.
asking instead, okay, the brain is in this network state now, and then the organism goes into a different circumstance or has a different behavioral challenge, and now it's in a different network state. How to get from one to the other?
So would it be correct to assume that we can claim that we understand a process only when we can actually predict or we can perturb it in a specified manner? So, for instance, in this case, to understand the switching, the idea is to be at a level at which we would know the triggers, whether it may be hormonal or it may be, sensory or it may be, any other mode, and we will be able to perturb the brain state or predict
Mhm.
the flip of the brain states or the collision of, recruitment of different brain regions.
Yeah, we might be able to predict without knowing the mechanism,
Yeah,
right? And we might know the mechanism without being able to predict. Um,
you're right. You're right. Both are
so
possible.
So I think those don't necessarily go hand in hand. I wouldn't want to say we don't understand unless we can X, right? Babylonian astronomy had really, really, really good. So back to, gathering data in the absence of theory, they
Right.
had really, really good predictions of
Almost
celestial
every
events.
almost every culture had, you're right,
Yeah,
some or the other model of or calendar of predictions.
yeah.
Yes.
But in this, but they had, tables that would tell you when the next eclipse was going to happen, and when
Right.
Venus was going to transit Mars, and but no mechanical theory there.
Hmm.
Um, and yeah, and then so I don't think any one thing is the harbinger of understanding necessarily. Um, it's going to be this interaction between mechanistic explanation and
Hmm.
predictive power, and then just particular interests in, you have a question that you want answered,
Yeah.
or you have a condition you want cured. Um, there was I worked as an engineer when I was an undergraduate. I worked as an engineering intern. Um, and I was working on the project to really try to. So had a big assembly line. We're making spark plugs, right? It's the right. Anyway, we
Yeah.
have this big assembly line. We're trying to predict what all the factors are that end up at the end of the assembly line with a spark plug that's within the quality tolerances we were trying to hit.
Mm.
and which things made the most difference if it got out of whack to the end result.
Yeah.
I was, helping out with very systematic experiments, um, and to figure this out so we can get much better control over the whole process. Meanwhile, we had this engineer on staff, and things would go wrong, right? Because they were doing testing constantly at the endpoint,
Yeah.
and the plugs would go out of spec, and they tell the guy, well, here's what's happening, and he'd go down and he'd kind of look at the line and he'd start fiddling a few knobs and it'd fix it.
Mm.
Now, did he understand? Well, at a
Yeah.
certain level, no, he didn't. But gosh, he sure had a lot of insight into that system.
Some heuristics, yes.
Well, or whatever. I don't know what it was that he was able to do, but he was highly
Uh,
successful in making sure that that system got back into operating condition. And a good doctor can be like that, right?
right.
So we don't necessarily need to know why this is going to work, but years and years of experience with patients under a particular set of have exhibiting a particular set of symptoms. Well, let's try this,
Mhm.
and it works, and it's kind of miraculous. But I mean, that's a kind of really important ability, that we don't often call understanding, but is certainly part of,
Yeah.
of, yeah, anyway. So, um,
No, I see. So one thing I'm convinced, after talking with you is we definitely need more psychology and more philosophy in neuroscience training. Because, I mean, even from the simple idea of what is a mechanism to, for instance, the end goals and just now the distinction between understanding and being able to, predict or manipulate
or
are
fix,
is,
manipulate, yeah.
yeah, are are very
Um,
important things.
right. And yeah, so I agree with you in general, by the way. One of the, when I was at Franklin and Marshall, one of the uh, subfields we had really hard time hiring in was in neuroscience, right? I was in the psych department, psychology department. And we interviewed these neuroscientists, incredibly well trained, um, technically very proficient. You ask them big questions, and we were at a small liberal arts college, right? So we cared about
Yeah.
how the questions we were asking and the education we were giving students, how each thing related to each other thing,
Mm.
and very very little ability often to answer those kinds of questions. They weren't trained to think that way.
Yeah.
And that's not necessarily neglect on the part of the field of neuroscience. It's just, gosh, if you've got to master a whole bunch of really complicated experimental techniques, you don't necessarily have a lot of time to be thinking about high level questions like what a function is and what the
Oh,
difference is between understanding and
yeah.
manipulating and prediction and
Also, the funding structure, because now you have to finish that work in a certain amount of time, and most of it is basically data. So you tend to hire more, electrical engineers and, people with background in computation than actually people who understand philosophy or neuroscience or psychology and things like that.
yeah.
So,
So, I mean, I agree that in the ideal world that those would be really important
mhm.
uh, things to include in an education, and include
Right.
education for scientists. But I don't know, um, you can understand why that's a difficult ask.
Right. On that note, I would ask you a little more about, given your experience about science communication. So, for instance, when you look at a structure of scientific article, it has remained same over the last, 6, 7 decades. It's
Yeah,
more complicated now. It allows more supplementary and, things have changed a little bit, online format. But it's mostly, introduction, methods, results, discussion, typical format. The conferences have remained the same, the same poster presentations with like the data. In terms of how we communicate, yeah, of course, podcast and individual interviews have been recently, new things where we can actually record more informal communications and more contemplations. But do you think that we need some innovation at the level of how we actually communicate science as well, within sciences themselves, more than these dry reports, but more where actually people with distinct theories come together to work on a project and falsify design experiments, for instance, just one example. to experiments which have the capability to falsify each of these four theories rather than all these four theories running their own pyramid schemes, across four different geographical locations or four different Ivy League universities or four different journals. Like, do we need more innovation than how we do science and communicate?
Well, so I certainly think we need more people whose primary contribution to science is in terms of not just aggregation, but synthesis,
Hmm.
right? And this gets back to some of the things we said already.
Yeah.
You know, you don't just want to take the next step along the particular experimental paradigm that you're on, but you need to be able to understand how that relates to other stuff that's happening.
Hmm.
And there's not a lot of time or reward for that sort of work. Uh, it's why I think that there's been a growing number of philosophers who have kind of taken up that
Yes.
work. Me, Tony Chimero, Philippe de Brigard. Um, uh, there are others because we're often in a unique position to be able to do that work and be rewarded for it in a way that a scientist with a say a tenure track job in neuroscience is going to be less likely to be rewarded for it. But there aren't that many of us
Yeah.
trained in that way, and it would be really useful to have more folks like that.
Right.
I think so. That's part of the answer to your question. The other is, yeah, it has to do with just straight up communication and what we include. I'll tell you a couple of stories. So when I was then an engineering intern, of course, we had to write reports on what we were doing, and there was a very strict format for the engineers. Um, and Meanwhile, I'm being told by the management that none of them understood the engineers' reports.
Hmm.
So I, as it were, not knowing any better, started writing my reports in a different sort of way.
Hmm.
Management loved it. My fellow
Yeah.
engineers hated it
Yeah.
because they had come to expect a very particular set of a kind of information presented in a very particular way, and they weren't
Hmm.
finding what they needed.
Hmm.
The managers were, but not the engineers. And so I don't know whether it was a middle ground or whether there had to be someone whose job it was to translate, as it were, from one to the other, because both are useful, right?
Hmm.
What I was asked to do by the engineers was different from what I was asked to do by the managers,
Hmm.
and both probably had use,
Hmm.
but they weren't the same thing. And then there's the question of what you put into one of these. I was trying to reproduce a set of experiments that I found really fascinating, and I couldn't reproduce it.
Hmm.
And I met the senior author at a conference, and I said, I'm having a really hard time reproducing the experiments. Simple behavioral experiment. In classic cognitive psychology, right? You see a thing
Yeah.
on a screen and you make a response with whatever device. Um, and he goes, well, okay, tell me what you're doing. And I told him, and he goes, wait, you're what? And so, well, you give the response. I have a joystick, and it's either up or
Yeah.
down for yes or no. He goes, oh, no, you can't do it with a joystick.
Huh.
What? And it's not like they didn't say it was a button box they were using,
Mhm.
but it was a button box they were using. And somehow he knew that a joystick wouldn't work.
Mhm. Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
and that's a detail that I just completely ignored because why would a button box versus because at least in theory, the difference was making a response that's further away from you versus closer to you.
Yeah.
Joystick has all those characteristics, but no, you can't do it that way.
Hmm.
And he knew that.
Hmm.
But that sort of detail doesn't get included. And I think that's true. That's just one example of a lot of um, the art, as it were, that goes into successful experimental work
Hmm.
that never ends up being reported in the actual journal articles, right?
Right.
How delicate is this phenomenon, and what kinds of things do you end up having to do to elicit it?
Yeah.
And that's what gets passed on in apprenticeships,
Hmm.
right? You end up, and I never apprenticed in this guy's lab,
Yeah.
right? I just read his reports and tried to do it my own. If I had apprenticed in his lab, I probably could have reproduced what he was doing because it relied, in addition to the things that he reported on, it relied on a whole bunch of other stuff. And the contribution of that other stuff is unknown.
Yes. Well, but one can argue that, you should not have that much of art because the more art you have, the less generalized and the less implications of your work is.
Yeah. No, well, I think that's right. Um, but just to your question of the
Yes.
what we communicate,
Right, right.
it might at least point to where that divide between the art and the science is. And I hesitate to say that because I don't want to make it seem like art is a bad thing and science is the good thing. But in this particular thing, the kind of tacit knowledge that
Hmm.
you need to have
Yeah,
to make an experiment work, um, and whose contribution to the outcome of the experiment, to the eliciting of the phenomena is unknown, pointing to that is probably useful.
right,
Because why did a button box work and not a joystick?
right.
There's probably an interesting question there. I never followed up on it in this
Hmm.
case, but there's probably an interesting question there.
Of course.
And no one even knew to ask it because until
Hmm.
I failed a series of experiments, um, I didn't know there was an issue here. And
Hmm.
not just failed, but I happened to run into the lead author at a conference.
Right. So this argues for even more detailed, articles rather than actually, making it more informal. I mean, from an engineering perspective, you want even more stringent report,
Yeah.
even more management unfriendly, probably.
Yeah, 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 maybe. I think the problem was that he did say that he used a button box.
Mhm.
I didn't know that that was important,
Right, right, right,
right?
right.
And so it comes down to, and he might have known it was important, but not enough, not in a way that to say, oh, and by the way, anyone who's trying to reproduce this, don't use this other kind of
Yeah, that's
device,
true. Can't expect that to write from anyone. Yes.
right?
Yeah.
So no, there's a kind of a, and this is why apprenticeships are so important in science, of course, as well.
Hmm.
Um, but no, it does end up anyway. But the point, going back to the initial point, having folks whose main contribution to the discipline is in looking across different labs and different even different subfields and trying to put stuff together.
Yeah.
That's the sort of person who might notice, oh, well, this lab gets a little bit different results than this other lab. What's the real difference between these two? Oh,
Hmm.
well, it comes down to the particulars of the equipment they use. Okay, well, that's interesting.
Yeah.
What's the relevant difference here? And that could provide insight.
And these things can be promoted top down. So for instance, for NIH grants, there's a condition. I mean, it's not explicit, but they mostly reject your grant if you do not have a biostatistician. Even if you might know more statistics than an average biostatistician, even then there can be an argument. So people tend to, especially for larger grants, they tend to have a formal biostatistician with a biostatistics degree, in it. Uh, so it's kind of cuts both ways. So, and I understand, the rationale, historically why that was made a mandatory or, you know, uh, as an important component of grant. Likewise, you can actually have a philosopher of science or a philosopher of neuroscience or in general, somebody more from the synthesizing background or credentials can be part of a lot of basic science
Mhm.
from a top-down, enforcement to make sure that actually synthesis goes on rather than just data being gathered with no connections made
Yeah.
across.
Yeah. Yeah. A colleague of mine said he had an amazing experience at a genetics conference. Now he's a philosopher of biology, and genetics is one of the main things he studies. And I don't know, he doesn't know himself who had the idea, but they just invited him to their conference and it was all just straight up
Yeah.
no. And they said, well, what we want you to do is just go to a bunch of sessions
Mm.
and think about it. And at the end of our conference, we're going to ask you to give a lecture on what you saw.
Mm.
And so, implicitly it was asking him to go and, well, who knows? But what he started to write and think about was, both the differences and the similarities, what was happening across, it was a fairly large genetics conference, what was happening across different subfields and what have you. And they said that it was like really super useful
Hmm.
to have someone whose only job it was to go from place to place, and kind of put together the pieces into an emerging picture.
Hmm.
And that's not the job of typically of a scientist going to a conference.
Right.
You're going to find out what, Dr. A did because Dr. A is working on a similar problem to what you're working on,
Yeah.
and you're going to learn from that, and so on and so forth. So that's why many big conferences, Society for Neuroscience, right, in particular, is tracked,
Hmm.
right? You've got all these different tracks
Yeah.
because the
Right.
idea is, well, you can go to track Q, and those are the only things that are going to be important to you, or the mostly it's going to be there.
Hmm.
Which is a very different experience than just wandering around the poster session, and seeing the range of things that's happening and thinking about that. Um, yeah, I had a colleague. I was reading something, and a colleague came to my office and said, what are you looking at?" Um, I said, "Well, there's a really cool paper on X and Y." I was like, "Wow." He goes, "How do you have time to read so broadly?"
Hmm.
Because I barely keep up with my field.
Yeah.
And I said, "Oh, I guess it's because I don't have a field."
Hmm. Right. That makes sense. I mean, I myself, when I go to conferences, I'm not interested in methods or results. I'm actually having glances, like I'm more interested in that amorphous aura of the conference than
Mhm.
actually any single experiment because ultimately it's a vibe and it's I mean these are like voodoo words I'm using, but you know what I'm trying to say here, right? So that's the purpose of a conference rather than being learning a particular method because those things are available in those articles. They will be published or they have already been published what is presented at the conference, right? So
Right.
it's more the 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 meta ideas being presented or where the things are going, which is more helpful from the conference I myself have felt.
Yeah. Yeah.
Uh,
Anyway, this is
so
again
I
yet
was
another
listening.
plea for diversity in approaches here.
I was listening to one of the professors in economics yesterday. His podcast with one of the economics channels, and he was mentioning he's from Johns Hopkins that how in the initial time when he started as a professor, there used to be a lot of polymathic professors. So
Mm.
there was a polymathic culture among in the academic community, which means that most of the people were very wide-read and had discourses on wide-ranging topics, which he himself has seen that now very few. It's kind of a fortunate event that you meet somebody who's polymathic, and he was talking about the benefits of or the magic of polymathic personalities,
Mhm.
basically. So I kind of agree with you, uh, that it kind of helps.
Well, it does, and it's amusing because I agree, and
Yeah.
there are reasons that that's come to pass.
Mhm.
And of course, and it's not like people haven't noticed.
Yeah.
And the way that universities are compensating for it is by talking a lot about interdisciplinary work
Yes. Right.
and how important that is.
Yeah.
We're going to reproduce what we already had
Yeah.
and have largely lost by now focusing on bringing together teams of people from different disciplines.
Hmm.
The trouble is, as anyone who's participated in those kind of, that's hard work, and
Yeah.
you spend a lot of time trying to figure out what the other person is saying, and you can often do much better work than you would have done on your own, no question.
Hmm.
But there's also a much higher failure rate,
Right.
and it's more expensive,
Hmm.
um, and uh, and it's just as a way of reproducing what we'd had already by, as you say, having cultivating professionals with polymathic personalities,
Hmm.
and we're trying to now reproduce that at the level of a team.
Yeah.
And it's yeah.
Yeah.
Um,
Polymathic individuals also thrive more in less formal and less constrained environment. And I think as academics have become more and more structured and constrained,
yeah,
it has not promoted polymathic personalities in general.
yeah.
So,
No, that's right.
Mr. Anderson, one last question which I would like you to touch upon, before we close out this session is on AI. Now, you know that you have been in that field, forever, right? one way or the other. In fact, trained, when were not aware of AI, and probably when I was not even born, right?
Hmm.
So, from the early days of, prospective AI. So now, given how accessible AI is and how good it is, I mean, it is amazing at some of the things I use it for. Like, it is better than like 90% PhD students in some of the things, right? Uh, for routine tasks, I would
Yeah,
argue.
I mean, if you narrow down the task
If you narrow down the task,
sufficiently, then
exactly.
yeah, yeah.
Exactly, right? If you narrow down and you well define it, it will take a PhD student 4 years to learn some techniques which AI is doing good with like in a few seconds. So now there is a tendency now to equate that expertise of AI to or to reduce the human expertise to the level of AI. Like this is not something. So the two ways to look at. Some people have moved the goalpost, like, oh, this was not the most important part of cognition we were interested in.
Hmm.
So they have removed that from that profoundness of human things, or some who have started equating that AI with human consciousness, the other way
Right.
around. So where do you stand on that, and where do you think would these developments in AI will influence how neuroscientists and the whole enterprise of modern behavioral cognitive and all these sciences move towards?
Yeah. So, I mean, I guess initially what I would say is that that common move to say whenever AI accomplishes something, well, that's not the thing that makes humans humans anyway.
Yeah.
That's the same as moving the goalposts on something like representation.
Yes.
That's not being honest
Right.
about what you care about and sticking and saying. Now, what you should say is, "Wow,
Hmm.
that's amazing. I wonder if they do it the same way humans do. And if they do, we've learned something really important about us. And if they don't, we've learned something about both of us, about the
Hmm.
machines and about us."
Hmm.
Right? So it should never be dismissed, these accomplishments, right?
Yeah.
When uh, Deep Blue, conquered chess and then Go, and now we've got the large language models, able to write essays and summaries and things.
Oh, amazing
Um,
poetry.
yeah, yeah. Or at least poetry that's judged to be of high quality.
Yes. Let's judge
We
for
have to
that.
ask about our metrics here,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, yeah. Of
Uh,
course.
in those things that I assume you're referring to, those are instances of poetry judged by a general audience typically,
Hmm.
right? So it's like survey,
Yeah.
it's a survey judgment. And I'm not saying that's not important, um, and doesn't give us some insight into what these machines are doing. So that it needs to be taken very seriously. Um, and even when you think that they're not doing things, as I say, the way that humans are doing them, that's really important.
Yeah.
So I've got a fairly recent piece with a grad student of mine, Heather Champion, where we look at the kinds of representations that are apparently being generated by some of these machine learning systems, and and comparing them to what we think humans might be doing, and they look really different from what we'd expect. And again, it's a win both ways. Either that means humans are using those things as well, in which case we
Hmm.
really got to rethink the connection between psychology and experience and low-level uh, neuropsychological functions. Or we've got to say, well, there are many different ways to come to the same ends, which of course we know in some sense already, but many different ways to come to the same ends. Um, and machines are giving us another case in which you can have intelligent outputs without the same mechanisms being responsible for them. Anyway, so that's being dismissive is not the right answer. Um, that being said, you're right that these new systems, these next token prediction mechanisms, are really impressive. Um, but already we know ways in which they're suboptimal from the standpoint of human behavior.
Hmm.
And so the other mistake is to not focus on the failures of AI systems where they're suboptimal, where their differences is leading them um, into producing behaviors that we would want to avoid. Um, and I realized just the other day, talking with someone, so I did spend a bunch of time as an AI scientist, but just because of the lab I ended up in and the kind of work that I was doing, I've always focused on AI failures,
Mm,
right? And so a lot of the work um, I did had to do with, well, what do you do when the AI goes haywire?
mm,
Not in a Skynet sort of way, but just in a, it's giving you outputs that you might trust, but if you do trust, are going to lead to very bad real world
mm.
outcomes. And so I guess I tend to come to AI developments with that eye. Okay, great, that's cool.
Mm,
Um, where do they break? And how do we mitigate the effects of that breakage?
mm.
Right. And so the AI essay writing system that just make up references
Yes.
or just kind of perseverate.
And there have been publications with those references.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a major problem and should be the kind of clue that as powerful as these things are, they don't have the same constraints. Um, they're not operating under the same constraints that persons are. And insofar as that's true, we have to be really cautious about I mean, this move to deploy them across all kinds of industries. Um, uh, it's it's nuts. um, because we know we're sort of dazzled by the success, but we know already the ways in which they go off the rails.
Mm.
And those are right, that that fail rate is really important. Um,
I've experienced that in my own classroom where, I checked for assignments for AI writing. And now I mean, any software you use to check for AI has also very high false positive rates.
yeah,
So what do you do with it? Because you you have students who basically have written it themselves, but the AI is flagging them as AI, and then you have and when that happens, students learn. So even if they have copied with AI and you flag, they say like, oh, you know what? It has 5% false positive rate. So they come with that argument. So how to
yeah.
deal with those
No, it's pretty clear
those
that the
conditions?
policing tools are not useful right now
Yeah.
for whatever set of reasons. I know a lot of my colleagues, when they include writing as part of their curriculum, which is important to include
Hmm.
for all kinds of reasons,
Yeah.
they're largely doing in-class writing assignments.
Mm.
Now, there are always limitations to that
Mm.
because part of what is important to learn how to write is long form pieces,
Yes.
right?
And review and search and all these things. Yeah.
Reviews and things like that. And you can't translate those into in-class assignments.
Hmm.
So you're confident that your students did them
Yeah.
in real time in class. And that's good. It's got its uses. But the 5,000 page essay, which something like ChatGPT can do for you, where you can't necessarily, sometimes you can, obviously, but you can't reliably detect those things, at least with the policing tools we have. Yeah, there's definite open questions as to how do we teach writing now, and what aspects of writing do we, and how, and what do we emphasize?
Mm.
Um, but back to the theoretical issues, is this doing things the same way? Here's what we have to take seriously. It's doing this with essentially next token prediction, right?
Mm.
Um, in the same way that early neural net technology was like, well, that's just networks, passing on activation from one node to the next, and it's doing some really impressive things. And here we had been thinking at the time that humans were logic machines, and they're
Mm.
not doing logic in any straightforward sense. So we had to rethink maybe what humans are doing. Yeah, we did. We had to rethink that.
Yeah.
Now, were the neural nets as good as humans at anything? No, they were not.
Mm.
Um, and this class of AI system um, is highly successful under constrained circumstances and is doing it with this really low level, simple
Yeah.
mechanism, which is next token prediction. Well, gosh, maybe we use next token prediction for a whole lot more things as humans than we thought we did.
Mm.
And that would be an important thing to know about us if that's true.
Right.
But there's also lots of other stuff that's happening that this mechanism isn't capturing.
Hmm.
And so, yeah, without being dismissive of the successes, we also have to be really attentive to the failures, to the boundaries.
Right. And language is also, is a very, it's not as important as we attribute it, given that we are speaking and we are listening individuals. I mean, we have a whole bunch of, uh, quite a huge proportion of human population who cannot read or write in
Mm,
the world, who cannot hear or who cannot see or who cannot speak. And they all are functioning pretty well.
yeah,
So that's another, we have given language. Yeah, it's fascinating, but we have given it a lot of survival value than actually it has.
yeah. No, and that's true as well, and that's really important, right? So one of the striking things about human beings to me, and the subject of a book I have planned, is on what you might call resilience. I don't like to use that word because it has such a pop psychology connotation to it
Yeah.
now, but just this notion that, we can adjust to all sorts of circumstances, whether those are failures or just differences,
Yeah.
and thrive in all these different kinds of ways, right? So the person who, was never exposed to well, what was never given the opportunity to become literate,
Hmm.
nevertheless, can flourish in the world and even in a world of literate people.
Yes.
And the person who's blind or goes deaf, people find ways of compensating for that, and that's kind of an amazing thing.
Right. So I planned the ending, but this conversation made me, to ask you one more question if you have time. It's beyond what we planned. In terms of science communication, what do you think? Do we still have values for books, edited volumes, etc.? Why I'm asking you is because we publish a lot more journal articles now. We do not publish as frequently monographs as scientists used to produce in early days. There is no almost incentive to produce books and edited volumes, even though they take enormous, because I'm working on several of those. They take enormous
Yeah,
amount of time and effort from the editor or from the writer's side. Neither the academic structure in terms of your merits rewards you, nor the royalty side. I mean, most of us who we write scientific books, we know that it is not a lucrative, enterprise. So, where do you see the value of these edited volumes, where you bring in authors on the same topic and books in general in the current scheme of science
yeah.
in general, science?
Well, I'm still a book reader,
Yeah.
and hopefully will continue to be a book writer.
Hmm.
And that's because you can develop ideas, and in particular, connections between ideas in a manuscript of that length that you simply don't, you can't in a journal article length
Hmm.
treatment, right? So um, you can put things together. You can show things in a book that you can't show in an article. So I hope they're going to continue to have relevance for that,
Hmm.
right? Um, Edited collections are that's tough. I know I've done one, a couple, in fact, myself. I know you have. Um, just by the metrics, they get cited less
Yeah.
than articles or books. Um, so it's an interesting question what value they have. Um, One of the ways that I use them as a reader is discovering people whose work I might not have known, but that the editor saw that, oh, this person's work is actually related to the other person's work. So it's as a curatorial service, I think it has value, right? Because you're saying, no, actually, so and so, and who's never cited this
Yeah.
other person in the volume, and vice versa, they actually, have points of contact, and I can make that clear in the context of, an edited volume. So I think it's really useful, and that's what I find most useful about them. Which, by the way, does suggest that the best edited volumes might be the ones in which the editor does a lot more than editors normally do,
Yes.
which is so that is beyond merely gathering and co-publishing the papers, but also providing a commentary.
Yes. Commentary, and I mean, that's what, so for instance, I have come up with a new format where I ask all the contributors to to address specific questions rather than anything they want to say.
Yeah,
So I constrain them in a very different manner with this new
yeah.
way. But I agree
I
with you.
think I think that's right.
Yeah.
And so the more they come to resemble conversations,
Mhm.
the more useful they'll be.
One of the things which I would recommend a publisher is it's hard to cite when I'm curating these books, when I have to put the citation, it's hard to cite a chapter because of the who is the editor and a number of,
Yeah,
extra tabs which you have to collect manually because journals or publication houses have specific downloads for citations in the journal page, but they
yep,
have not done so in the book chapters page. If they
yep.
do that, perhaps we will see increase in book
Yeah,
citations.
yeah. If you can just go on Google Scholar and click cite
Yes.
and copy and paste it, yeah.
Yes, or also the download of the bib file and other files in the book chapter page itself. So there's an
Yep,
artificial divide in how web pages for book chapters work and for journal articles work. That
yep.
will solve a lot of issues there as well.
Yeah, at least some, yeah, for sure. And no, that's right. And part of the reason that edited volumes tend to get cited less
Yeah,
is because they're relatively less accessible.
accessible. Yes, you need to have
Um,
access to the whole book most of the times.
exactly. Yeah. So
So that was wonderful, Ms. Anderson. It was a great talk. We definitely touched a lot of issues, and not some of the issues in as much depth as I, wanted to, given the, paucity of time. And I hope that you would be willing, to come, again for
yeah,
some
sure.
more in-depth conversations. But it was amazing, and thank you so much for your precious time today.
Well, thank you. Thank you for doing this and bringing a lot of people to this kind of format.
Thank you so much.
Right.